Theresa May hails it as the biggest ever expulsion of Russian intelligence operatives. More than 120 diplomats sent home from 24 nations, with talk of scaled-down participation in next summer's World Cup by some, talk of retaliation from a Kremlin that denies unleashing a military-grade nerve agent in the southwestern English city of Salisbury. As ex-double agent Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia lie in critical condition, why did anyone expose up to 500 area residents to poison? How strong should the reaction be? Does Moscow really care? After all, Vladimir Putin used the accusations as a rallying cry against the West in the run-up to his re-election 9 days ago as president. That's in stark contrast, you might say, to some of the resentment being felt over Russia's domestic situation this Tuesday in Moscow and in several other cities. Rallies to ask for answers after the shopping center fire in the east of the country that's claimed 64 lives. The anger over public safety and services raises the question, this country that projects strength on the world stage, just how strong is it really? Today in the France 24 debate, looking at a situation where you have Russia against the West in this standoff. With us to talk about it is David Cadier, researcher at the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks as well to journalist and Russia watcher, Diane Palardy. Welcome to the show.
Thanks.
We're also joined from London by Philip Stoner, former deputy UK defense attaché in Paris, and from Moscow, Andrei Kortunov, who is Director General of the Russia International Affairs Council. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag F24debate, is definitely a Cold War feel. Belgium, the latest country to expel a Russian diplomat. Earlier it was NATO, tossing out 7 diplomats from the Russian mission to an alliance that was created, well, to stand up to the then Soviet Union. Kathy Clifford has more.
Yet more Russian diplomats sent packing as NATO announces it's expelling 7 staff on its Russian mission and denying a pending accreditation request for 3 others.
This sends a clear message to Russia that there are costs and consequences for its unacceptable and dangerous pattern of behaviors. And I actually think that Russia has underestimated the unity of NATO allies.
It adds to mounting international pressure on Moscow after governments of some 24 countries around the world expelled a total of well over 100 Russian diplomats. The US led the way, expelling 60. The latest to follow in their footsteps include Moldova, Ireland and Australia, each showing their solidarity with the UK, which points the finger at Russia for the recent nerve agent attack on former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia in southern England. Allegations the Kremlin denies, warning of a tit-for-tat response to those it says are pandering to British authorities.
We were right when we said there were very few truly independent countries in the modern world and in modern Europe. We know for sure that this is a result of colossal pressure and colossal blackmail, which are used by Washington.
London has expressed its thanks for the show of solidarity, an unprecedented international response, far bigger even than similar measures taken during the Cold War.
Diane Palardy, I just want to go over what we heard in that report from the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. He calls these expulsions blackmail by Washington. Why is he singling out Washington in particular?
Oh, because in Russia, there is always in the Russian government, there is always the belief that the US is behind everything, that the US is trying to pressure the EU and imposing its will on the EU, that basically the EU is waiting for Washington's order to act.
And you heard at the outset of that report, the NATO Secretary General saying this is great that all these countries are doing this. It, quote, sends a message. Does it send a message?
The message that...
to Moscow?
Well, I think the message was already clear a long time ago, since the sanctions started. The
sanctions over Ukraine?
Yeah. The message is just getting stronger from the EU and the US. But Russia has got the message a long time ago. And I think... It It doesn't really change. It's just escalating, but there is nothing really new for the government. And the foreign minister, the Russian foreign minister, said it. It's just, he said that the situation was confirmed to them.
Are these 24 countries, David Kedier, right to expel Russian diplomats?
Well, they're expelling personnel with diplomatic status. That's, for example, the official communique of the French presidency. Whether they're right, I think they're right to show solidarity with the UK. They're right to show unity among European member states. You talked of a signal. This is a strong signal precisely because Europeans managed to be united on a topic that usually disunite them, the relationship to Russia. Then whether it will actually affect Russia's foreign policy behavior, I have my doubt. But again, diplomacy is not just about constraining or coercing, but it's also about signaling, and that's what the Europeans are doing right now.
So you're not sure it'll have an impact, but it's still a good idea?
Well, I think we're at a stage in Europe-Russia relations where we cannot fix the crisis, we're trying to manage it, right? And I think many people in Europe feel helpless about the prospect of how this crisis will develop. And I do think that as Europeans, to show unity is a first step. I think there is at some point a need to put a foot down and draw some red lines about certain actions and domestic interferences. It's a bit like the sanctions that were mentioned. I mean, the sanctions have been having an effect on Russia's economy, but not an impact on Russia's policies, meaning it didn't lead Moscow to alter its behavior in Ukraine, for example. Well, with this kind of actions, it might be a bit the same. An effect on Russia-Western relations, maybe not an impact on Russia's policies.
Is it almost win-win? Because we saw with the presidential election, the scandal really came to a head in the days leading up to the re-election of Vladimir Putin. And in Russia, it sort of galvanized voters behind Putin in that us versus them mentality that you were describing at the outset, Diane.
Yes, I mean, Vladimir Putin has always played on that card, being the strong man, restoring an image of a strong Russia, which had been deteriorating with the fall of the USSR. And I think, yes, it's a win-win for him right now.
He hasn't overplayed it.
I don't think so. I mean, it's always been his card, being the strong man. Russia needs a strong man because Russians are all about the strongest, who's going to be the strongest. So he needed to impose himself like that.
Supporters of Russia insist that they want proof that Moscow was involved in the use of that deadly nerve agent. The UK Prime Minister says it's there.
Now up to 25 countries that have conducted expulsions. And also earlier this afternoon, the NATO Secretary-General confirmed Russia's mission to NATO has been reduced from 30 to 20. So that's a further action that has been taken. And obviously I welcome the international support that we have garnered in this. Although, as I said in the House yesterday, this isn't just a matter of the UK's position and working with the UK. It's, I think, in the national security interests of the individual countries concerned.
For more, let's cross to London and Philip Stoner. Thank you for joining us, Philip. Has Theresa May made the convincing argument that it's definitely the Russians that are behind the poisoning in Salisbury?
Personally, I don't think she has. I think there's still a long way to go. And of course, as you know, the issue here is twofold. Currently, there is a sort of a sense within the country that Russia needs to be held account for a number of different reasons, not least of all Crimea, Ukraine, and so forth, but also because of Russia's actions inside the Security Council as a permanent member. There's a growing perception, I believe, here in the UK that really Russia is an inconvenient member of that particular body. The problem for Theresa May is that now she's come out and made this clear. She has certainly gained an advantage over the opposition party in this country. And there is a sort of sense that, it's good to actually go and try and hit Russia on this one. On the other hand, if you go back to 2002, 2003, when I was in NATO myself and personally saw what was going on with the issue of the dodgy dossiers, as it became called, it was clear that something was slightly amiss even then but nobody talked about it. And I think the British people are being once bitten and twice shy. And there is a sense within this country at the moment that unless Theresa May really does come up and make it absolutely crystal clear with clear evidence, positive evidence, that actually this may all fall flat. She may fall flat in her face.
Really? May it all fall flat, Philip? Because there is that mounting pressure on her and the Home Secretary over those 14 and now possibly 15 suspicious deaths that have taken place over the years of Putin opponents on UK soil.
Well, I think, that may well be the case. But the problem is they've had difficulty actually finding, from what I can make out, actually finding the necessary evidence and making it clear to everybody concerned, in particular to a third party. We will see what the OPCW comes up with. That, of course, will be critical to this. But I would reiterate the sense within the country here is one that, we haven't forgotten what came out of the Chilcot inquiry, which was basically there was a rush to judgment, and that I think, as far as the British memory is concerned, is still very prevalent.
Hang on, the Chilcot inquiry is about Iraq, though.
Absolutely, and that dates back to 2002, and the dodgy dossier produced by Tony Blair in the 45 Minutes.
Right.
And that was an issue where Blair basically took the intelligence.
But hang on, we're talking about a different prime minister, and we're talking about a different country here.
No, I agree, but the same people, and that's my point. The British people have long memories, and I think there is, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn tried it on. He was booed and hissed out in his question times against Theresa May, but Jeremy Corbyn basically said, listen, we may well be committing the same mistake again.
When it comes to this deadly nerve agent, David Cadier, is there plausible deniability on the part of Moscow? Can they make a convincing argument to say they have nothing to do with it?
Well, it's a very complicated matter. I mean, I do agree that there are a lot of strange things, a lot of unknowns. It doesn't really make sense for Russia to order such thing now. At the same time, as the communique of the EU said, there are not so many other plausible explanations. And the fact is that if it's a nerve agent that was developed at some point by Russia, even if it's hanging out somewhere, it becomes the problem of Russia. And so there needs to be more cooperation on the inquiry and so on with the British authorities. But I think the issue also is, you talked about a win-win. In the end, it needs to be calibrated. That's my point. Each action needs to call for response. We shouldn't mix everything, right? We shouldn't mix Ukraine. We shouldn't mix other dossiers, Syria, and so on.
But just about the Skripal case, last week when we had the same, when we were talking about it 2 weeks ago, when it first broke, some were saying, the expulsion of those 23 diplomats by the UK, that doesn't hurt. What hurts a lot more is sanctions against oligarchs that are close to Putin.
Yeah, many people make this argument about London in particular, saying that there's a lot of those oligarchs that have assets in London, and if you want to hit them, London is a place to start, but instead the UK targeted diplomats. Again, sending a signal with not so many probably consequences in terms of efficiency of what is trying to be achieved.
Let's go to Moscow. Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Thank you for being with us in the France 24 debate. What impact will the expulsion of these diplomats have?
Well, I think that we limit our channels of communication with the United Kingdom and with the United States. I don't understand how we can resolve the crisis if these lines of communications are no longer there.
Can't resolve the crisis of communication? Is it all theater, or will it have an impact?
I don't think it will have an impact. I think that Putin will not yield under pressure. He will definitely reciprocate. I think that we will see major expulsions of American diplomats from Moscow coming soon. We don't know yet whether Putin is in a mood for escalation, whether he limits himself to just a tit-for-tat reaction, or he will do something more. But I think that it is probably realistic to expect that the lines of communication between Russia and the West will continue to shrink.
will continue to shrink, and Diane Palardy, that's when it's no longer win-win. It becomes a zero-sum game. Just remember a few years ago when Russia was part of then the G8, and that mission to NATO is set up in the 1990s when there was a warming of ties. Is that over for good?
Over for good, I wouldn't say, but Russia is trying to turn towards Asia to basically make an alternative power, an alternative clout. It's turning more and more towards China, for instance, for economic deals.
China, which has condemned, by the way, the expulsion of these diplomats from all these countries. We're going to pick up on these points when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the mass expulsion over the past 48 hours of Russian diplomats from some 24 countries across 3 continents. With us to talk about it is Diane Palardy, freelance journalist and Russia watcher, David Cadier, who's with the French Political Science Institute Sciences Po. From London, Philip Stoner, former Deputy UK Defense Attaché here in Paris. Thanks for joining us again. Thanks as well to Andrei Kortunov from Moscow, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. We were talking about what measures to take just before the break. Iceland is not expelling diplomats, but the tiny nation of 300,000 has announced that for its first participation in a World Cup, cabinet members won't be traveling to the tournament, and neither will the president.
He was, of course, consulted, and it's very clear that the government and top officials, including the president, will not attend given the current situation.
Now, there was a little bit of talk about World Cup boycotts by some, but of course, football fans won the argument on that one. David Cadier, is it logical to, again, we're talking about what is the right response?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe if you kick out all the good teams and just leave France at the World Cup, it might be a good idea. But more seriously, I think this is not linked at all to the Skripal case. I mean, what are the links between the World Cup football and the Skripal case, right? The diplomat expulsion, the argument is made that those people...
Because it was a front page of the Daily Mail. How can we go to Putin's World Cup?
Yeah, well, I think we shouldn't mix everything, right? Because precisely otherwise, we're going to achieve the opposite of what we're trying to do. That's why I think Europe has to be strategic in its response, meaning understanding the consequences of its own action and not taking measures that will create the opposite result. I mean, it was mentioned that the expulsion will be spun domestically as another sign that the West is confrontational, is actually against Russia, while engaging, while being firm and clairvoyant, is more important. So cold head rather than cold war would be the motto I think the Europe should follow.
Vladimir Putin projecting strength on the world stage when he takes on the West over the Skripal case, but it doesn't mean he has a blank check. In Moscow's Pushkin Square this Tuesday, a rally to demand answers after the mall fire in Siberia that's left dozens dead, many of them children. Scenes reminiscent of the emotion and anger that followed the 2011 plane crash that wiped out the Lokomotiv Yaroslav ice hockey team. Kathy Clifford has more.
Hundreds gathered in the Siberian city of Kemerovo to demand a full probe following a fire in a shopping mall that killed scores of people on Sunday. The protesters say the authorities are hiding the real scale of the disaster. They gathered as Russian President Vladimir Putin left flowers at a makeshift memorial in the city to pay tribute to the victims of one of the deadliest fires in Russia in recent years.
Why did this happen? It was because of some criminal negligence, because of slovenliness. How could this ever happen? What was the reason? What are the consequences?
Local authorities have ordered 3 days of mourning to mark the deaths of dozens of people, many of them children, in Sunday's blaze.
People are in shock after the incident and the fact there is corruption. The shopping centre's fire security system didn't work. Nobody cared.
Investigators say a security guard turned off the public address system at the shopping mall and exits were illegally blocked. Locals said the cinema often locked its doors to stop people going in without tickets because it was understaffed. More than 600 fire officers were deployed in the rescue efforts. Arrests have been made, and all of the country's shopping malls with entertainment areas are now to be checked for fire safety.
Andrei Kortunov, let me ask you, we see Russia on the world stage projecting strength, but how strong is Vladimir Putin in light of misgivings about this tragedy in Siberia?
Well, I think it is still an open question because, of course, if you take the results of the recent election, Putin appears to be very strong. He got more votes than probably he himself had hoped to get. At the same time, one can question to what extent this support is stable or fragile. And I don't think that we have any consensus in Russia about that one. But even people who might have a lot of sympathy towards Putin himself can still be very critical of regional authorities and of the political system. So I think that the protest moods are definitely growing in the country, maybe not very fast, but they are growing.
And what's your feeling after, again, these two different stories, but both of them that raise the question of how strong is Russia?
Well, I think that these two stories might look similar, but they have profoundly different impact on the population. Because the Skripal story and what followed the Skripal story, for many Russians, seems to be another proof that the West is against Russia, that the West doesn't treat Russia fairly, that Russia is blamed for everything which happens in this world, and basically we should unite in our attempts to resist the Western pressure. It's almost like a besieged fortress. However, this fire in Kemerovo had a very different impact because many people believe that something is profoundly wrong about how regions are run, if not the whole country. And I think that definitely people are getting tired of this, all this, and they question the efficiency of the system which allows such things to happen.
Diane Bellardi, a giant with feet of clay, because here we're talking about, because we've done, how many shows have we done talking about Russia's impact in Syria, Russia's impact in Europe. Many French politicians now admire Vladimir Putin more than before. And yet here you have this sort of, these two parallel universes, what goes on the world stage and what goes on domestically.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, nothing really changed because this internal problem of corruption in Russia has always been here, and people are still trying to tackle it. I read that the corruption could be on every level, in this case, inspectors in charge of checking emergency exits and emergency systems could be corrupted, could be paid bribes, not to check or to check very quickly. It's companies who built the buildings as well who could be involved, because between the projects before the building is built and the actual building when it's built, there are changes that are overlooked. It's more expensive, for instance, to build exits, as many exits as the law requires, for instance. So sometimes builders just overlook this. So the corruption could be on every level.
All right, so there's people fed up with corruption on the domestic level, but rallying around their president on when it comes to foreign policy. Just before the break, David Gadier, you were saying how if you hit Russia with the wrong kind of sanctions, it's going to backfire, galvanize people even more, that us versus them mentality is going to be whipped up. The UK Prime Minister, Theresa May, despite it all, with the Skripal case, sending a letter of condolence to Vladimir Putin over the mall fire in Siberia. Your thoughts on that?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to mention indeed those two events as we're doing now, because one thing actually that could maybe have thought through is to postpone the expulsion of diplomats so that it doesn't happen the day of this human tragedy in Russia. Obviously, the decision was taken a couple of days earlier in Brussels by EU member states, but we could wonder whether it might have been possible for Europeans to decide, in light of the situation, to stick to the decision, but to implement it in a couple of days. Then on those two things, I think it's very important that we do not only react and sometimes condemn what Russia is doing, but we also try to understand why Russia is doing what it is doing. And for that, we need to look at the domestic situation, the domestic sources of Russia's foreign policy, the internal configuration of the political system. And in that sense, the expulsion of diplomat, as we heard from Andrei, will only galvanize, as you said, the base. The other events will have potentially much bigger consequences in terms of this internal political situation in Russia. So in my view, Russia watchers might be more concerned with this second event today. This is the big story.
Yeah, let's look at maybe some of the images from earlier this evening in Moscow. Can you make out what they're saying, Diane Penalty? Andrei Kortunov, can you hear what they're chanting?
Yeah, but basically they are crying that I have not elected you. So it's a kind of political protest.
What does that tell you?
Well, I think that
is this just inside? Is this just inside of the Moscow bubble? Opponents there, and that we should really not take this out of context, or is there, a sizable portion of the population?
I wouldn't dismiss it. I think, it would be wrong to ignore it. The phenomenon of Navalny is a serious phenomenon, and though Navalny was not allowed to run for presidency in the country, still he has a lot of supporters across the country, not just in Moscow, not just in large metropolitan areas, but even in small townships. Because indeed, people are concerned about life not being fair. And it's not about democracy. It is something that cuts across political allegiances and political parties. It doesn't matter who you are. Are you a Democrat? Are you a nationalist, a liberal, or conservative? But if you feel that life is not fair, this is a pretty serious thing.
And again, that brings us to the point we were making with David Cadier. Let me put it to you, Philip Stoner, which is, how do you handle it when you're in the West and there is, again, this military-grade nerve agent which has been unleashed in Salisbury, potentially contaminating up to 500 people? That's what's really sparked shock around the world. But how do you react?
Well, I mean, I agree. But, I think you have to look very carefully at the language. Every time we read about it, it's all military grade, it's military this. And I think, you have to be slightly sort of circumspect in the way in which these things are termed and phrased. Now, it may well be that the case that it is indeed military grade and it's very dangerous and all the rest of it. But you have to also realize that as a result of this has actually served Theresa May particularly well in the country, because she was going through a particularly bad stage as far as post-Brexit, this issue with Brexit is concerned. And now that she's been able to actually reinforce her base with her strong actions in this case. And this is something which, frankly, she's built on not only within the country, but also with fellow European countries and also America coming in. I think I'm not sure what Trump really thinks about this, but America's come in and expelled diplomats as well. So I think the whole issue, one has to be very careful before we sort of leap into yet another hole and say it's all clear-cut and crystal clear as to what actually happened, what took place, and what we should do.
Well, UK authorities are pretty definitive, though, that this could only have been developed in Russia in a laboratory.
That's what we are told, and maybe that is the case. But as I've said before, I think there is a sentiment within this country which basically is saying, okay, hang on a minute. I am not so sure whether I necessarily believe everything I'm told by my prime minister, and that I think is an issue. It may well be that the prime minister is absolutely correct, and she's going to prove it, and the OPCW will come out with all the evidence, and that is great, and that's fantastic. And maybe but there is this feeling at the moment, and this is where Corbyn is actually sort of peddling his wares and sort of saying, listen, you know, there is a sort of sense of rush to judgment here, and we have to be careful. And I think this whole issue of division, and if Russia is interested in dividing the UK, this may be something that they might be trying to do. We shall see. But I think, unfortunately, it's too early to actually say definitively what has actually happened.
All right, so perhaps a credibility gap for some, and it's tearing apart the Labour Party in the UK. David Cadier, your thoughts on the number of diplomats expelled, and particularly the United States, 60 diplomats on U.S. soil, the closing of the Russian consulate in Seattle, 12 of those diplomats at the United Nations in New York. The United States, where we've raised questions about Donald Trump's relations with Russia, the accusations, the investigations going on regarding his election in 2016, yet 60 diplomats expelled.
Yeah, well, everything is larger in the US, right, including diplomatic representation. So obviously they have a big contingent, so maybe those numbers have to also be put in perspective of the size of the country, of the number of representations. It might also have to do with internal changes in the US. We had a new national security advisor, John Bolton, who said to be a hawk on Russia. Did he feed into that decision? I don't have any information on that, but it happened a couple of days after he came into the White House.
And looking at Europe, you know, we're playing this game now where we go down the list of who has expelled a diplomat and who hasn't. Greece and Cyprus have not, for instance. Neither has Luxembourg. But we have a diplomat expelled in Ireland. That's created a stir because it's a neutral country. Your thoughts when you look down the list of who's expelled diplomats, what does it tell you?
Well, I think this is a very interesting question because European member states have different positions, different approaches towards Russia, and there is no single bullet to explain these positions. It's not just geography, because countries far away from Russia's border, like the UK, like Sweden, tend to be hawks on Russia, right? It's not just history, because countries like Slovakia or Bulgaria, former Warsaw Pact member, are rather less hawkish on Russia or even more cooperative. So I think the numbers have had to do a lot with domestic internal negotiations, sometimes with contingent reasons. For example, the Czech Republic expelled 3 diplomats. Usually the current Czech government is not among the level of, let's say, Poland or the Baltic states in being adopting confrontational attitudes towards Russia. What happened, it seems, on the part of the Czech Republic is that the Czech authorities were deeply annoyed that Russia, in its defense on the Skripal case, suggested that the nerve agent might have come from former Czechoslovakia. So you see that the actual output in terms of who's expulsing how many diplomats has a lot to do with internal EU cooking, but also in domestic local situations.
Yeah, one country where it's really dividing public opinion is Austria. Austria, which says that it wants to be the neutral power broker, that it's a sort of a capital of the world for many things, and yet the opposition in Austria is saying, hey, there's a coalition government that includes a far right which is close to Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, there is this domestic political explanation, but also, I would say, the identity of the country. I mean, it's not for nothing that you have the headquarters of the OSCE, the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, in Vienna. This organization is an East-West institution where we're supposed to try to build confidence between East and West, to actually have lines of communication, to avoid conflict. And if you remove diplomacy being, in the first instance, about easing tensions, about preventing conflict, we also might want to think whether Vienna had this idea of wanting to stay the diplomatic hub of the East-West relations.
Philip Stoner, have you got your scorecard of who's been expelled from where?
I had a look at it there. I haven't got it in front of me, but I noticed. I mean, interestingly enough, all of the Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, obviously they were very keen to get involved. But I think, I would not underestimate the fact that Russia is perceived to being basically a bad element within the class at the moment. And that's why I would come back to my point about the UN Security Council. You know, Russia has been consistently being sort of inconvenient in the way in which they've acted there. And I think this is a way by which the sort of, dare I say it, you know, the broad brush of the international community, although I hate that expression, is seen to be able to push back in some sort of way and basically try and put Russia in its place.
One final question. Diane Palardi, four diplomats expelled from France. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, invited in May to that big economic conference that takes place in St. Petersburg. Should he be going?
Of course, you shouldn't stop complete dialogue with Russia. It's especially economic dialogue. It's in the interest of the EU, and I mean.
And you expect him to go?
Maybe not him, but Total and Engie's top directors, probably, yeah.
Yeah, because the heads of the big energy companies.
Of course. Right. Noting that Nord Stream 2 is being built, even though there are US sanctions that tried to stop it. I think France will be represented, maybe not by the president, but it will be represented.
All right, yeah, the business interests matter a lot, especially at that conference in St. Petersburg. I want to thank our panel once again, David Cadier, Diane Palardi, Philip Stoner in London, and Andrei Kortunov in Moscow. Stay with us. Media Watch is next.